Alright, let's start talking about Active Directory domains, because this is the core of your Active Directory deployment. An Active Directory domain is the container where user accounts are created and stored. It's also used to store objects representing servers and workstations that are joined to the domain, along with other network resources like printers. Joining a computer to the domain means that it's accessible within the domain and has access to other resources in the domain. In order to join a computer to the Active Directory domain, it needs to be part of the same network as the servers providing the domain services, which are called domain controllers. Active Directory is very tied to DNS, and we'll talk a lot about domain controllers in this video series, but basically, they're just Windows Server computers that have Active Directory domain services role enabled. A domain has a domain name like example.org.com. It doesn't have to be .com though, because the domain doesn't have to be unique on the internet when it's implemented on premises. So something like company.pri will work, but Microsoft recommends using DNS names that are registered with an internet domain provider, so they're globally unique. That way, if your organization ever merges with, acquires, or is acquired by another company, you won't have a conflict with the domain names. A domain also has another name called the NetBIOS name, and this goes back to pre-Windows 2000 days, before Active Directory was introduced. NetBIOS is a naming format for a network service on a Windows network. The NetBIOS name is typically the first 15 letters of the prefix part of the DNS name for the domain. So in this case, it would be example.org without the .com. It's set by default when you configure Active Directory, as you'll see later, but it cannot be changed. NetBIOS was used to find services on the network, and it can still be used today by older applications on the network that require it. When a user logs in to the network, they have to indicate the domain they're logging into. So the domain name is something the user is aware of, and they can use either the NetBIOS name or the DNS name for the domain. The type of data that's stored in Active Directory is defined by the schema. Each object in Active Directory is an instance of a class in the schema, and attributes define the information stored in each class. There is a standard schema that defines the data structure, and it's evolved over each version of Active Directory. It's also possible to extend the schema so administrators can address classes or attributes. The data and schema definition are stored in a file called ntds.dit. So it's not an SQL database or anything like that. It's just actually an instance of what's called an extensible storage engine. The data store for Active Directory is stored on servers called domain controllers. They're just Windows servers that have the domain services role enabled. We'll talk a lot more about domain controllers throughout this video series, but let's actually go into the domain controller and take a look. This is a virtual machine running Windows 2022. I have the Active Directory domain services role already installed inside Server Manager. I'll go to the Tools menu and open up Active Directory users and computers. The root domain is here. There are several containers here also. Some of these are created automatically, like the computers and users containers. Let's look inside the users container. There are some users defined here like this account I created, as well as many groups. Groups are used to simplify the granting of permissions to access resources on the network. Many of these groups are built in, meaning they were created when I installed the Active Directory domain services role. They're used for administrating the network. Some of these groups are meant to contain certain users, like the domain admins group. Some of these groups are meant to contain computer objects, like the domain computers group. And some of these user accounts in this container aren't users at all, they're service accounts. Those are security principles that represent services, like this one that was created by the service that synchronizes users to Active Directory. Let's open up this user account. So the user class is part of the schema of Active Directory, and these are some of the attributes defined for that class: the user's name, email, telephone, and organizational information. And on the account tab, you can see the user's login name, and there's an alternative login that uses the NetBIOS name of the domain. There are also attributes here related to the user's password and other authentication options. On the member tab, all the groups that the user belongs to are listed here. There are two built-in groups, and this group that I created, which is defined in the same container. If I go over to File Explorer and I have a file share mapped to a folder on a different computer on the network. If I right-click and select Properties on the Security tab, you can see the custom group was given permission to access and modify the contents of this remote folder. So groups are a way to grant the same set of privileges to multiple users. Let's go back to Active Directory Users and Computers window, and in the domain data store, we store information about users and resources on the network, because that can quickly involve the management of thousands or hundreds of thousands of objects. Active Directory Domain Services provides a feature to help us with the management called Organizational Units, or OUs for short. Using OUs, you can create a hierarchy of objects. So you might have an OU for a branch office location, and within that OU have another OU that groups sets of computers together or sets of users. Then those organizational units can use delegated administration. So certain administrators are responsible for managing a certain organizational unit. You can also assign group policy objects, or GPOs, to organizational units. Group policy objects allow you to attach policies, like preventing users from installing software on computers in a certain OU. Delegated administration and group policy are really the two use cases for organizational units. But those features make administrating Active Directory much easier and more organized. Now let's talk briefly about how objects are referenced and found in Active Directory. Every object in Active Directory gets what's called a distinguished name, which is the name that uniquely identifies an entire entry in the directory. It's made up of a sequence of attribute value pairs separated by a comma. It starts with the most specific attribute, which is usually some sort of name, and continues to progressively broader attributes, like the container the object is stored in, down to the domain components, the organizational name, and COM. If the object is part of organizational units, that hierarchy is defined in the distinguished name also. The distinguished name concept is defined by LDAP standard, which stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It allows queries to quickly access objects information. A query from a resource on the network might ask the domain controller for all the information about a specific user in the directory by passing in those parts of the distinguished name. Or it might ask for all the users with an attribute called department = HR. The point is that LDAP is used by Active Directory to efficiently access data with the directory, and the distinguished name of the object helps with that search. In order to see the distinguished name of objects in every Active Directory users and computers, you need to enable enhanced features from the View menu. That reveals some other containers in the interface, but it also enables other tabs on the properties for users. In the attribute editor, you can scroll down and see the distinguished name for the user object. All the computers that are joined to the network can query Active Directory using LDAP, but how do they find these domain controllers to send their queries to? The answer is DNS, or Domain Name System. And let's go on to Server Manager, and from the Tools menu, open up DNS Manager. DNS is an important part of Active Directory, and if you're installing a new Active Directory domain in Forest, DNS is automatically installed. Records are created in DNS to help find domain controllers when AD operations are performed on the network, like authentication and searching. DNS also helps domain controllers find each other, because each domain controller in the domain needs a copy of the data store. There are service locator records here for 4 domain controllers on this network. Each of the services is available on each domain controller, so the global catalog, the Kerberos security services, the K-password, which is used to locate the key distribution center for the Kerberos password changing service, and there are service locator records for LDAP services. When designing your Active Directory deployment, you need to keep in mind that the domain is a boundary of replication for all of the objects in the data store. Each domain controller will get a copy of the data in the data store, and replicating that data takes time and uses network bandwidth. We'll be taking we will be talking about replication a lot more in the video series and how it impacts the design of your Active Directory deployment. The domain is also a security boundary for administration. There are domain administrator roles that give various levels of control over the domain. Microsoft's recommendation when designing your Active Directory management is to have a single domain, if possible, to contain all the users and resources in your organization. Sometimes that's not possible, or you may want those administrative boundaries and replication boundaries. So that is it for now, and in the next video we will be covering up we will be talking about forests and trusts.